This week I'll show you how to paint this stunning magnolia flower with watercolor using my Learn to Paint as you paint approach. So whatever your level, you can really level up your watercolor painting game and paint with confidence. So grab a cuppa and let's get painting. Okay, so let's talk materials before we dive in. The colours that I'm using today are all by Mungyo, and I will list everything in the description box underneath this video. And this is the colour chart that I've used to match up my colours, and I'll link a card at the top of your screen if you want to make your own. Now there's a line drawing and reference photograph available, and I'll tell you a little bit later on how you can obtain these for free if you'd like to paint along. The brushes that I'm using are little spotter brushes from Rosemary Co, and I'll put a link in the description if you'd like to use these particular brushes, which I love for this kind of painting. Now, watercolor painting is all about painting in layers, and it's important that our first washes or first layers are very weak and watery so that we can build up our colors slowly. If you're new to watercolor painting, I highly recommend that you watch this video right through to the end so you can sort of get past that tricky part that you may think isn't right, but trust me, it's all part of the process. So to begin with, I'm working wet in wet, which means I'm applying the water directly to the paper where I want the paint to go. The paper that I'm using today is a sort of fine watercolor grade paper, and it's made by Arches. It's 300 gram and it's made from cotton, and it has a rough texture, so it's cold pressed. I particularly like this paper for this kind of painting because you can put many layers of watercolor paint on. As you can see, I've mixed opera pink in my palette here, and I'm just dropping the paint where I've put the water, just to the outside edge of this petal. Notice how the paint blurs gently into the wet paper, giving it that lovely soft outline that we want. So the consistency of the paint that I have on my palette is really watery, but it's a very strong color, as you can see, so you need to go really easy with this. Now that I've done the first sort of wash on the first petal here, I'm doing exactly the same on the lower petal and just dropping in that pigment with my number 1 size spotter brush and just gently making it blur into the paper as I did with the first one. You can see how I'm really taking advantage of that damp paper by pulling the paint into place using my brush like this. You can see it already has the makings of a sort of shape on the petal, but by pushing that paint around onto the damp paper, it makes it really easy. Now, if I'd been working wet on dry, which means I would be applying the paint directly onto the paper, it would be a lot more difficult to achieve this. So it's important for these initial washes that we're working wet in wet. We will be adding finer details a lot later on, but for now, as I said, it's all about building up those layers really slowly. We're just using a few colours for this tutorial, and if you haven't got these paints, as I said at the start, use the nearest colours that you have within your own set. You can usually find something really similar. But these spotter brushes are ideal for this kind of painting. I find that it gives full control of the paint. Just dropping in the colours where I feel they are needed. And using a smaller brush just to blend the colours like this. Now, I have done a full tutorial on how to blend your watercolour paints using different types of watercolour paper, and I will link it in the card above your screen right now. So if you'd like to click through and have a look at that later on after you've watched this video, then do feel free to have a look where I explain in greater detail my application process. Now, I'm using wet on dry paint here, which means I'm applying the paint directly onto the paper. Given the fact that it's such a small area, wet on wet wasn't particularly needed for this particular section. So we're just applying the pink colour to begin with. Notice how I'm just pushing that pigment into the pencil line using my brush. This is the number 2 size spotter. But like I said, use whatever brushes that you have. So now that this wash is dry, we can have a look at the petal on the left hand side, and I've mixed a tiny bit of burnt umber. Once again, just applying the water where I want the paint to go. At the very start of this tutorial, I mentioned that we have a line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this video, indeed all of our video tutorials, and you can find them over in our Facebook group. I will put a link in the description box underneath this video so you can join us over there and have access to the line drawing and reference photograph for free, as well as post your own paintings and have some critique from me and our other members. We're a wonderful community over there, very, very friendly bunch of people, so do consider joining us and you can join in with our weekly tutorials. Now that everything's dry and I've cleaned down my palette, I'm using my flat synthetic brush to just soften some of the edges where I feel the paint has dried and created a sort of tide mark. You'll find that with watercolor paint you get this kind of dry edge, and I like to soften it through with this brush. At this point I decided to add another colour. This is lamp black. Now by mixing black with a lot of water we can have a really, really subtle grey tone, and I wanted to add some shading and a little bit of depth to some of the other areas of the petals. We don't want this to look black, we want it to be a really, really subtle shade of grey because we want the petals to stand out from the paper. So notice that this is really, really watery with just a tiny bit of pigment. I've noticed at this point that I forgot to add a little pencil line, so I'm just gently putting this in here to create a little bit of shape where I missed that line out. So just adding the water again and dropping in that pigment. Just applying the water to the other petals where I feel this kind of light grey tone is needed, just to separate the white of the petal from the paper. A couple of you have mentioned or have asked me why I don't keep the reference photograph in the screen. There's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, I do supply the reference photograph for you to use, and I do think that it can kind of get in the way a little bit, so I tend not to leave it in the screen, although I do put it there from time to time. I just find it too much of a distraction. Also, it takes up too much space and you maybe can't see where I'm using my palettes or paints, so I'd rather not have it in the screen all the time, but as I've said, you can have access to it for free. So I'm just applying this really watered down grey tone, as you can see here. Cleaning my brush each time, of course, and using my flat synthetic brush once again to blend. This is dampened with a bit of water, and you can see how I'm just rubbing the paper to merge the colours together. Now, if botanical painting is your thing and you'd like really in-depth tutorials, I must tell you about our Patreon site where we do full-length botanical art tutorials every single month, as well as another level where we have more of a sort of weekly vlog type channel where we have weekly videos. So if botanical painting is your thing and you want full-length tutorials that are ad-free, then maybe you'd like to have a look at our Patreon site, and once again I will link it in the description box underneath this video. So everything is now dry and we need to put our first washes onto the leaves. I'm mixing two petals here. We have sap green in one, sap green with hooker's green in the other, and I'm also going to add a tiny bit of Vandyke brown to the hooker's green and sap green, taking out some of that kind of acidic colour green that we have going on. It was a little bit too bright. And I'm also just adding my water to the palette here, which helps the water application rather than putting it into my jar, which means that I'm flooding the brush with water. So once again, I'm adding the water to the area that I want to drop that green tone, being careful around the edge where the flower is, because we don't want any of that green to go on those lovely white and pale pink petals. So now that I've got the colour in place, I'm just dropping in that lime green tone, which is the sap green. I think that sap green from Mungyo paints, which is the brand that I'm using, is very, very bright. So just dropping this in all over that one colour, as you can see. By the way, if you are enjoying this video, do give it a thumbs up. It's a way of letting YouTube know that you're enjoying my content, and it's a way of you supporting me on my channel. Also, you may want to consider subscribing. We do have weekly videos that are launched every single Tuesday, and if you hit that notification bell to the side, you'll get notified every time we release new content, so you don't miss out on anything. So you can see me dropping in the darker colour green on the bottom here, once again wet in wet, making sure that I stay away from those beautiful pale colours. Now remember, these are just our first washes and we're going to be building them up as we go through the tutorial. So you can see I'm just continuing to drop in that paint into the already damp paint and just letting it splurge naturally as we did when we did the petals. This is what I call my template wash, which means that when it dries down a little later, we can start to build on it with confidence, knowing where we're going to put the colours. I've switched down to my number 0 size brush here, and because the area is once again so tiny where this little gap is, I'm just painting it in wet on dry. Switching over to the leaves on the other side and the stem of the flower, I'm just dropping in the paint as before. This time I'm doing it with a little bit more water because I felt that these lower leaves were paler because we're showing the underside of the leaf here, and I just wanted it to be slightly out of focus and a little bit more blurred. I'm just mixing a tiny puddle of hooker's green here, which has a little bit more of a blue tone, and just dropping this in on the other part of the leaf here, and once again blending it into the paper. Cleaning my brush, patting it on the kitchen towel and just blending it through, just to give it that lovely soft edge. And adding a really watery mix of hooker's green on the stem like this. And we're going to let it dry. So with everything dry, and once again I've cleaned down my palette, I'm adding my drops of water, usually about 3 or 4 in this little dish that I have here. So we're going back to the petals. So we have a petal of Opera and also a petal of Crimson Lake. Notice this time that the pigment is a lot thicker, but still very, very movable, and we can start to build up these really vibrant, bold pink colours. Once again, working wet in wet, applying the water where we want the paint to go. So it's around that pencil line like this where we have the initial pink wash, and then just dropping in some of that opera pink to begin with. When you apply your water and you're working wet and wet, just give it a minute or 2 to sink into the paper. Don't go straight in with your paint. It does help if you just let it settle for a moment or 2. Just how I'm taking advantage yet again of that damp paint and just dropping tiny parts of the pigment into that wet paper. Watching it do the hard work for you by doing that natural blur that we want, and just making sure that I apply that paint right up to the pencil line to keep it nice and neat. So this is a number 4 size spotter. Spotters are very easy for this kind of watercolor painting because of their shorter bristle. It just means that you have more control over your paint application. Notice now that I'm pulling the paint into kind of a curved shape to give the illusion of that petal being curved and not flat, just while that paper is still wet, just to give that soft, natural blur that I keep talking about. Once again, as that paint is drying, it's retracting a little bit from the pencil line, so I'm pushing it into that as we go. And once again on this small area, working wet on dry, so I'm just directly painting the paint straight onto the dry paper, and again for this area here. Cleaning my brush, patting it onto the kitchen paper and gently blurring the colours together. As I said, we have got a full video on this explaining the blending method that I use, and I'll link it in the description box underneath this video. So going back to the petal on the right hand side, once again the same process, wet in wet, just applying that water where we want the paint to go. Of course, it's really important that the layers are dry before you do the next layer, so we're just dropping in the ochre once again, keeping out of the whiter areas or the grey, the very subtle grey areas I should say, and just dropping in that paint like this. Exactly the same process as we've used on the other petal. And I'm sort of flitting between the Crimson Lake and the ochre. So looking at the kind of browny tone that we have, I have a mixture here of burnt umber, which is a kind of watery consistency again. And I'm adding to this a tiny bit of lamp black. I probably put a little bit too much there, and I'm just putting it on this outside edge. It does have a kind of rusty look about it, so the burnt umber works really well with that tiny hint of pink that we already have in place. But make sure that you blend it out. I'm just putting a tiny bit of that very, very pale black or grey tone on the bottom, just to give it a little bit more shape. We don't want it to look flat. We want to give the viewer the illusion of this having some form, so our tonal values are just as important as our colours. Notice just by adding that tiny bit of grey tone there, it gives the illusion of the fold being in place. And I'm just using my flat synthetic brush just to tidy up that little edge there. And patting it dry where I went outside the pencil line. This paper is 100% cotton, and because it's a cold press paper, it is quite robust. Were I using a maybe hot press paper, I couldn't be as aggressive with the paint on the paper as this. I really love this kind of paper. So I'm just adding the pale grey tone to this petal here, just to show that it is a little bit in shade and it's not a flat white colour as before. So we can add a little bit of that grey tone and a tiny bit of that rusty tone to this bottom part here. Just dropping in a tiny bit of that burnt umber. And once again blending it through. The bottom section of this is definitely a little bit darker, but I'll just leave it to dry a little bit before I drop that colour in. Using a number 0 size brush to paint in here. And picking up a tiny bit of burnt umber and just blending that through. And just a few little squiggles at the bottom here. I did feel that I needed to add a tiny bit more contrast here, so I'm just dropping in a tiny bit of that burnt umber just to give that edge a little bit more shape. And now that this is partially dry, just dropping in a little bit more of the black brown tone to give a bit more dimension. So once again, I'm mixing some green, same colours as before. We have a couple of puddles of, this is sap, and we're going to mix hookers in one with a tiny bit of Vandyke brown, as you can see here. Also added a tiny bit of lamp black because we want the colour to be nice and bright. So we want the colour to have a little bit more depth. So I'm adding, once again, wet on wet. So we're just applying this onto the leaf like this. I do apologise, this is slightly out of focus, but it won't be for very long, I promise you. It's just I was slightly out there with my camera. So just bear with me while I drop these colours in. You can see me adding the two tones that I have here on my palette, just dropping them in right up to that pencil line as before to really start to build up some depth of colour onto this leaf. Patting my brush dry because I don't want to flood that paper with water or pigment, and just adding a tiny bit more of the hooker's green to this puddle here. I felt that the paint was slightly too watery, and adding a tiny bit more lamp black just to have that depth of colour. You'll notice from the reference photograph that it is a little bit darker around that area here, and certainly towards the outside edge. Patting my brush dry, and once it's settling into the paper, you can see how I'm using the opportunity to merge that damp paint into the damp paper, making it go where I want it to go. So you can see me here just using a damp brush to lift out the central vein. You'll need to do this a few times, and I went on to do it again once the paint had been slightly drier. And you can see that little vein in the middle there. I did go outside the pencil line, so I'm using my number 2 size flat synthetic brush there just to dab it off and pat it dry with a kitchen towel, and then we can paint in the sharper outline once it's dry, not a problem. So going back to the bottom petal here and using a watered down mix of the colour that I already have on my palette, you can see I'm applying this paint wet on dry right up to that pencil line again. Once I've applied the colour and I'm happy with the position of it, I clean my brush in the water and pat it onto the kitchen roll and blend out that outside edge, as you can see here, to soften it through. And I continue this with a few of the other veins, as you can see, negatively painting a little gap which represents the vein. So I'm not taking the paint right the way to the top of the leaf, just at the pencil line on the bottom, and blending it through to give a soft edge at the top. And I'll continue this right the way across this little leaf here. So having completed all of it, we can now clean down the palette again and go back to these vibrant, beautiful petals. So we have the two colours again, we have Opera and also the Crimson Lake. Now this time, once again, we're going to do a slightly thicker consistency. We want these colours to really pop off the page. Notice the consistency of the paint is very different now, and I'm using my number 2 size spotter to apply the Opera colour simply straight from that palette, wet on dry. Simply wet on dry, so I'm applying the paint directly onto the paper. Now because we have our template wash in place, it's really easy to see where we can apply this paint. Just following the pattern that is already in place, patting my brush dry once again and blending in that colour like this. And the same to the top. Where these two petals join, I felt that there was a definite sort of darker tone on the smaller element here. So I applied a little bit more of the Opera pink to the inner edge where the petals meet. Using my number 0 size spotter to do this, and a tiny bit of that Crimson Lake. I did feel that the Opera pink on its own was a little too pink, and at this point I decided to add a tiny bit of burnt umber just to add a smidgen of that kind of orangey hue. You can see that it really does stand out. So a tiny bit of lamp black here, and I'm mixing it to a really sort of subtle grey tone with a smidgen of pink, because I didn't want this area to be stark white. As you can see, I'm just dropping that in here. And the same to the top. So it is just a mixture of the lamp black with a tiny bit of Opera pink, but notice how watery that consistency is. You want it to have a really gentle hue, nothing very strong here because it will just look false. You want it to have this gentle shadow. So I'm adding some of the lamp black right to that edge of that petal, to the straight to the pencil line, and then just gently blending it out with some just a damp brush. Now by doing this, it really gives the illusion of that shadow and gives it a sort of three-dimensional look. It makes that petal stand away from the underlying petal. So now we can start to really drop in these bold colours here. So now I'm working wet on dry with the same colours that are on my palette. This is just Opera on its own, and see how I'm just following the pattern that's there now and just dropping in these stronger colours. I'm flitting between Opera and Crimson Lake, making sure that that darker pink is dark enough, as you can see from the reference photograph. And I find that the Crimson Lake works really, really well for this. Just following the colours and patterns that we have in place. So because we put the initial washes in, this has now taken out the guesswork. Just creating a little bit of texture and a little bit of form by doing this. And of course we have now our darker values in place as well, which gives this a really good, strong three-dimensional look as we work through. You can see how that petal looks as if it's curved and not flat. So back to this petal here, we are now working with Opera on its own once again, and we will be dropping in the Crimson Lake as we need to. This is a number 0 size spotter that I'm using here. And again on this one here. And a tiny bit to the top of this folded over petal and blending it through as before. I'd like to sharpen up the edges at this point, so I'm using my number 0 size brush just to do this. Now, strictly speaking, this colour isn't really there, but I did feel I wanted to add a tiny bit of that pink tone. So this is just a watered down version of the Opera with the burnt umber, and I'm just blending that into the grey tone that was there. And I think this really adds a little something to it. And just darkening up the colours with the Crimson Lake. Sharpening up any edges that I feel are needed at this point. This tiny brush that I'm using is actually a number 2 spotter, but it's a different brand, and it does have a sort of slightly sharper point. So still with this tiny little brush, just sharpening up that outside edge. And here on the top. I'm using the tip of this brush to just slightly outline with the pink colour, and it just separates the petals from each other, and I'm adding a tiny bit of the pink tone with a tiny bit of the burnt umber just to this area here, and once again I'll soften that through with a tiny bit of water. So now we can start to really build up these greens. Make sure that everything's dry, and once again go into the same colours, but this time with a lot more pigment. So we have our sap green, our hooker's green, and we're going to add some Vandyke brown and of course some black as before. We're going to put hookers with sap in one puddle, well in 2 puddles actually, but one being slightly thicker. So we want this green to be really sort of gloopy and strong in colour. So we're going to really drop these stronger colours onto this upper leaf now. I'm using the hooker's green with the sap green mixed towards the top because I don't want this to look flat. This time taking advantage of that lifted out vein in the middle and painting around it like this to enhance it. Once I've painted around that vein, I'm going to blend it in, but first of all I'm just picking up the pigment with my brush of that darker green tone and pushing it right up to that pencil line where the petal overlaps the leaf. Because this is a cold press 100% cotton paper, you'll see that it takes the paint application really well. I'm a great fan of Daler Rowney's mixed media paper, but I don't think I could have done as many layers with this depth of colour on a mixed media paper. That's why this kind of paper comes into its own. It really is great for adding lots and lots of layers without them going muddy. So just dropping in that kind of cooler green tone at the top. Once again, working around that vein that we lifted out like this. And we're negatively painting in that central vein, which means that we're just simply painting around the shape to create a shape. And you can go as close as you want to, but obviously the closer that you get, the more care that you have to take, but it does make it look a lot more realistic the closer you can get, so that you're narrowing in that gap. So going back to the number 0 size spotter, just to go up to that outside edge with care. Sharpening up any edges at this point. For these leaves, they haven't exactly gone true to the photograph. I just want to have the various sort of green tones in there and just make them stand out. Just tidying up that outside edge. So going back down to this bottom leaf, I'm just adding the mix of hooker's green and sap green and just sharpening up that outside edge before blending it through. Just following that natural curve. You can see how I'm softening that paint through with my brush like this. And the same for the stem. Just where we have that pencil line, we can start to enhance this now. And just soften it through as before. So I'm just adding a tiny bit more of the burnt umber and just sharpening up this little area here just to give it a little bit of definition, and the same underneath this part. And just sharpening up the underside of the stem of this leaf. And of course this area here, I felt that it needed a tiny bit more of the watered down hooker's green, just to sort of separate it from the underside. So I'm adding more lamp black to the green tones that I've got on my palette here. And now I want to start putting in a little bit of a pattern by adding some, just a little bit of interest. So I've added to that some Hooker's green, and with my smaller brush you can see how I'm just enhancing bits and pieces. So just going around that central vein. Kind of creating a few little veins here and there before I splurge them out, before I blend them in with watercolor. Just adding a few little veins here and there before I blend them through with a damp brush like this. And we're almost done, so I'm going to stop talking and let you watch a little bit more of this tutorial, listening to some music while I just repeat the process until this magnolia flower is complete. I'll say thank you now for watching, and remember to hit the subscribe button if you don't want to miss new content every single Tuesday. I'll let you continue in peace, and I'll see you next week.